In the first weeks of 1943 on the ridges of Guadalcanal, soldiers of the Japanese 17th Army were starving to death. These were veterans of conquest that had swept across Southeast Asia to the very edge of Australia. Now their rations were gone. Men were reduced to boiling grass, stripping bark from the trees, and chewing leather just to survive. Out in the dark water to the north, a stretch the Americans were starting to call Iron Bottom Sound, the Imperial Japanese Navy still ruled the night. Their fast cruisers and destroyers sailed in after sunset, sank American warships, and slipped away again before dawn. Diaries recovered from dead Japanese soldiers revealed a disturbing realization. These men recognized they hadn't been broken in battle. In many of their firefights, they had held their ground and made the Americans pay for every yard. They were describing a process of destruction that had almost nothing to do with traditional defeat. This paradox defines the true turning point of the Pacific War. On Guadalcanal, the Americans utilized a method of systematic erasure that rendered Japanese courage, training, and tactical success entirely beside the point. Popular history usually frames the Battle of Midway as the decisive end of Japanese dominance. In a single morning in June 1942, American dive bombers sank 4 Japanese fleet carriers, halting an unbroken run of naval expansion. But Midway was a single spectacular shock. Reversing the direction of the war required an agonizing 6-month, 3-dimensional grind. On Guadalcanal, the fighting never stopped, raging on land, at sea, and in the air all at once, week after week. This island became the wound that would not close. It was the specific location where 2 completely incompatible theories of war finally collided. The Imperial Japanese military of 1942 was optimized for a single, devastating event they called the decisive battle. Inspired by their 1905 victory over the Russian fleet at Tsushima, they believed a war against the United States would be won in a single afternoon by a superior force of elite ships and crews. To achieve this, Japan invested heavily in irreplaceable elite components. While American pilots were competent, Japanese naval aviators were the elite of the elite. Their training was so demanding and selective that only a tiny handful of candidates ever earned their wings, resulting in some of the finest pilots on Earth. The Japanese soldier followed the same logic. He was trained for extreme physical endurance and battlefield aggression, taught that surrender was a disgrace, and that willpower could overcome any material disadvantage in equipment or food. Japan had built the perfect instrument for a short war of high-quality components. However, this focus on individual perfection created a mathematical vulnerability to a prolonged war of attrition. The American war machine operated on an industrial instinct. Driven by the pre-war Two-Ocean Navy Act and a massive civilian economy, the United States began to treat combat as a problem of production and replacement, rather than a contest of individual heroism. American shipyards moved beyond simple replacement and began multiplying the fleet's strength. Between 1942 and 1944, Japan managed to commission only 3 fleet carriers. In that same span, the United States commissioned 24 Essex-class carriers, with dozens of light and escort carriers following behind them. This philosophy allowed the United States to absorb tactical losses indefinitely. They aimed to make every battle expensive enough that the sheer volume of the exchange eventually bankrupted the Japanese Empire. While the Japanese sought the knockout blow, the Americans built a machine that could absorb hits and keep grinding forward until factory output itself decided the victor. These 2 doctrines met at a single, muddy airstrip, Henderson Field. This airfield was the hinge of the entire campaign. Whoever controlled the air over the field in daylight controlled the sea, as ships without air cover could not survive the daylight hours. Because American aircraft owned the sky by day, the Japanese Navy was forced into a desperate improvisation called rat transportation. They used fast destroyers to smuggle inadequate supplies and troops to the island at night, racing to be gone before sunrise. Above the jungle, a structural cruelty hollowed out Japanese air power. They kept their best pilots at the front until they were killed, losing years of experience in a single crash. The Americans rotated their veterans home to teach, investing their expertise into thousands of new pilots. Henderson Field functioned as a logistical trap. Its mere presence severed the Japanese army from its food sources and forced the Japanese Navy to slowly bleed its irreplaceable destroyer fleet dry just trying to reach them. By early 1943, the Japanese reached the end of their endurance. In a series of swift night runs, they successfully evacuated just over 10,000 skeletal, disease-ridden survivors, leaving the island to the Americans in the dark. The final statistics of the campaign reveal the true nature of the defeat. Of the 30,000 Japanese who died on and around Guadalcanal, historians estimate that only 5,000 fell in actual combat. The remaining 15,000 were killed by hunger and disease. Both sides faced the same tropical environment, and malaria alone sent thousands of Americans to the hospital. Because Americans controlled the sea and airfield, they could evacuate the sick, provide medical treatment, and pour in fresh medicated replacements by the shipload. On this island, the decisive difference rested in the capacity to resupply. The American logistical system converted a shared environmental nightmare into a strategic victory, while the Japanese absence of supply led directly to mass starvation. After the war, Japanese High Command admitted that Guadalcanal was the moment forward action ceased. They recognized that they had lost because they couldn't build up forces at anything like the speed the Americans could. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had predicted this exact disaster. Having seen American factories firsthand, he warned his government he could win victory after victory for 6 months. But he had absolutely no confidence in Japan's survival if the war dragged into its second and third years. Yamamoto's death in April 1943 was itself a product of the machine he feared. He was shot down over the Solomons by long-range American fighters, an operation orchestrated by the very industrial and intelligence coordination he had seen in the United States as a young officer. Guadalcanal proved that no amount of elite training or individual bravery can save an army from an unfavorable industrial equation. The island taught Japan that the moment the war became a contest of production, the outcome was already decided.